On this week's Bet the Process podcast, Rufus and I have on Judah Fortgang, who is Throw the Damn Ball on Twitter, and he is really sharp on same game parlays and kind of just researching football broadly, approaching it differently, like he's the modern day improvement to Aaron Schatz. We also talk a little bit about Survivor, do a brief trip through college, and with that, let's start the process. Welcome to another episode of the Bet the Process podcast. Rufus, Survivor.
Jeff.
I bet I know who you're gonna pick this week.
Well, Jeff, do you remember last week where I said, I bet I know who you're going to pick once you said you had a team picked and I guessed Bengals and you said, no, it wasn't Bengals. And then I picked Bengals.
Yeah, I was the product of recency bias, where in my mind, I saw a Bengals team that literally could not get off the field, or figuratively could not get off the field. Literally, they couldn't get off the field on third down. And it was like, it haunted my memory of that team, where I think that was a reasonable pick. And part of the reason that
Bengals,
I chose,
well, I picked them because I needed to set something. I wanted to set something right then. So in case I forgot, I would have a pick.
yeah.
And that actually worked out for me.
Well, so the reason I ended up choosing the 49ers, which I knew was going to be a popular choice, was I actually looked at the 49ers schedule and didn't think there was really a time that we were going to use that you would use them for like 7 or 8 weeks. Like, I looked at their full schedule, and then part of that calculus was on the fact that like the Cardinals were a pretty good team, but it doesn't seem like that's quite the case now. And so I think you're going to choose the 49ers this week because everyone else in the pool has already chosen the 49ers. And maybe I'm doing your work for you because I doubt you were actually going to put this level of work into this, but the 49ers would be the obvious choice for you this week.
Given that there are only 4 teams left, it makes, I think the level of research makes sense. And no, and it's also not that hard.
Yeah. No, it's not.
Right?
That's what I'm saying.
And
That's
at
not
the
that
same
hard.
time, like, it's okay to be chalky now. And not in terms of necessarily wanting to be the same as, like, I don't want to have the same pick as everyone, but the win equity part makes so much more of a difference than it did in week 1.
Sure.
Agree?
Yeah, and well, again, like, my analysis last week came down to like future value and win equity, right? Which were the two things, and less around game theory and what other people would choose. The miscalculation I made was literally like how amazing the Niners are as a pick this week when you're the only one that can pick them. I think that's the piece I missed.
So, and you're right. Like, I've already actually set my team as Niners, and it would probably take a lot for me to change that. Who are you considering? Because these are not teams I'd be picking anyway.
The Commanders of the Bears. I'm probably going to choose the Bears.
Man,
because
both of those teams just seem so tough to take. Like, how would you have any confidence in them?
I mean, there's not a lot of.
You love the rookie quarterbacks.
I don't love the rookie quarterbacks by any means, but I mean,
against Andy Dalton.
Yeah, I mean, that's the classic. That would be the classic, like, FU to Rufus, right? The Red Rocket, an old white quarterback, loses.
Hey,
doesn't
I like
perform.
old black quarterbacks too.
Okay, good to know. Good to know.
Or Jacoby Brissett's not actually that old.
But he plays like he's old, so
true.
Good for him. All right, let's welcome in Judah Fortgang. Really great interview. Hopefully you guys all listen to it. Different approach to betting, and kind of like making Rufus and I feel old and like dinosaurs. So let's welcome him in. We'll talk to you guys all again on the other side. We now welcome in Judah Fortgang to the Bet the Process podcast. Judah, welcome. Welcome to a world of process-driven thinking, or at least what we like to talk about. And obviously your process is very interesting. But before we get into that, Give us a little background on who you are, and how you got to be sitting here as one of the people who's lucky enough to talk to 7 listeners around the world.
Yeah, no, first off, thank you for having me. The answer is a bunch of luck, but I feel like everyone says like, oh, they don't have a traditional path. I do a bunch of kind of data science type things for a bunch of different kind of spots in this ecosystem. I actually studied political philosophy in college. I took one stat class, didn't major in math. I thought I was going to be a lawyer, and I had a friend who is a macroeconomist, and he got his start in the hedge fund world by writing down his trades and his process. And we used to talk football, and he said to me, like, you need to be doing the exact same thing. So I just kind of started blogging and writing about the process of why I was making the bets that I was making. And I was always kind of quantitatively minded, where I would look at numbers, and then I kind of taught myself the rest of the way there. I got extremely lucky. Ended up with an internship at Pro Football Focus, which is a football analytics company. I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar. And then kind of one thing led to the next. And now I do a bunch of betting, data science, all those sorts of things.
So can you give us a general approach that you have to betting? Where do you kind of find your alpha and where are your edges? I know that's a very broad question, but hopefully a starting point to jump into some things.
Yeah, I guess I'll just take this right into the parlays. I do not tend to see kind of median outcomes particularly well. I think where I tend to get kind of most of my edge is looking at particular game scripts and really leaning into those sorts of ideas. And that leads me to a parlay, because what a same game parlay can do is effectively tell a story through multiple pieces, which is, let's say for whatever reason, I think that this quarterback's going to have a great game, and he's going to be better than the market is pricing. And then you kind of ask second order questions of like, well, what happens next? Wide receiver is going to be the recipient of this game, and then like what happens on the other side when you're in this sort of game script. Let's say a team is playing the Ravens. They have like pretty drastic splits in their running back usage depending on whether they are winning or losing. Justice Hill is going to get a ton of receiving work. If I'm, for whatever reason, taking an opposing quarterback against the Ravens, maybe I want to bring that back with Justice Hill. And at some point, you can keep going and going and going of like, you have one effect, and then there are going to be second and third order effects that kind of trickle down. And you can really narrow in on that story through a parlay. So I'm trying to look for a lot of these angles where there's what I call a modeled relationship. So the way, if you think about how a bookmaker is pricing this, or a model is pricing this, is you don't have so much data to work with. Football is a game of small sample sizes, and you have to basically take the global relationship and say, like, in general, and this is the example I always like to use, say you are trying to bet on a wide receiver over wide receiver 1 and 2 alt overs and a running backs alt over. You are going to basically take the distribution of touches that is globally true, i.e. across the entire league, and kind of use that in your model. But certain teams have very narrow distribution. So wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, running back 1 might account for 70% of the touches for the league average, which is what's going to be priced in. But the Miami Dolphins, with one healthy running back, are going to give all the carries to Devon Achane, and most of the targets are going to go to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. So looking at those sorts of relationships where the modeled one kind of breaks down because of specific, whether it's team tendency, injuries, matchup, you name it, trying to effectively lean into that and those angles and tie it to a general story about how the game is going to be played, and use the same game parlay market to attack that.
In a case like this, go ahead, Rufus.
Jeff, when you do this, like what is your first step in trying to find these things? Are you first looking for the relationships that are sort of locally true but not globally true, and then do you go from there?
Yeah, so I know at this point what the global relationships are in football. It's not that complicated once you've kind of been in the weeds as I've been. And then it's a matter of, I have like basically a whole bunch of data that I'm consistently looking at. And sometimes you have to balance, and this is why you can't model it perfectly. I think you have to model kind of all the steps until you actually get to the point of creating a bet or a model. Sorry, not a model, or creating a bet, because you're going to run into the same issue if you model this out perfectly, because like you're going to run into the same small sample stuff. I'm betting mostly on the tails here. It's very difficult to capture that. So what I'm trying to do is look at the totality of data that I have and try and say, okay, this is a sample which is more relevant. You know, if we're talking about the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes, I trust 5 years worth of data more than, say, a team like the Saints right now, who changed their offensive coordinator and are an entirely different offense. And I'm basically kind of looking at team level data and then adjusting that to the matchups. And then I know what the global relationships are at this point. I can kind of see like, well, do I think that in this particular week, this is a relationship which kind of breaks the global relationship for whatever reason.
You've also found some relationships. For example, like last week, you talked about quarterbacks who rarely scramble are more sensitive to matchups than those who scramble more. And so, are there any other, I guess, global insights relationships that you've found that probably are not priced in and that people, I think, would find interesting?
Yeah, so I guess this is a nice segue into a bunch of work I've done in the past on like kind of what I like to call football think tank work, which are a lot of these studies that is exactly as you were saying. I don't think price into the market. So say an offensive lineman, I don't think offensive line injuries are created equal. And this is a study I've done, effectively going from like, let's just create fake Madden grades for this conversation, going from like a 90 to a 95. This is on a team building perspective. Does not matter as much as going from like a 90 to a 75. And like as you kind of fall down, basically like 90 is this magic number. It matters a lot more because offensive line is a weak link system. So if you think about a team that has a like okay left tackle to a really, really bad starting left tackle, that's going to matter a lot more. I've done a bunch of work with man and zone coverage, which basically says that in man coverage as opposed to zone coverage, the better player is going to win out more often. You can kind of think about it, it makes sense conceptually, where you kind of have, instead of like trying to find a soft spot in a zone, it's really just like a one-on-one kind of more pure athleticism sort of matchup. And it really is a reflection of the talent on the field. So like when the Jaguars play a ton of man coverage in week one with pretty weak cornerbacks against Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, it's not that shocking that both of those guys went for over 100 yards. Like that is a major, major mismatch. And not only is it more a reflection of the players on the field, but also the targets are much more predictable. So we can actually have much more confidence in the better player winning out in man versus zone. I have a bunch of these sorts of studies, but those are a couple to think about.
And I bet those are useful. I mean, not just for modeling the tails, but modeling, just regular straight props as well.
Yeah, for sure. Like the 49ers like last year had a like pretty drastic split depending on whether they're playing a man coverage team or a zone coverage team. Like Brandon Ayuk has like a 33% share versus man. This has changed from this season, and Deebo Samuel basically was flipped in zone because they're using him a lot more in the screen game. Like that's not priced in. The books are using medians for the most part, but there's pretty drastic splits depending on man versus zone coverage.
So 2 questions on this. One, this is going to sound very stupid. So hopefully it's not a dumb question, but if you are pricing tails and there's likely more, you kind of, I've heard you be dismissive of yourself where you're essentially saying like, oh, I'm not good at betting spreads and whatever's because I'm not good at pricing medians. But if you're pricing tails differently than other people, doesn't that inherently mean that your median might be different because you're pricing more likelihood on a tail? So couldn't you actually back into inefficiencies on a median outcome by having a narrative or a thesis, a hypothesis around a tail outcome being more likely?
For sure, but why would I do that? I think the whole point and the reason why I like this same game parlays in particular, I'm not worried about like liquidity here. In fact, like, and this is a separate conversation, like books are practically begging me to place parlays, but I'd rather like narrow in on my story, be really, really right about that story and get paid 15 to 1, 100 to 1 for that, as opposed to just like betting into minus 110s. And also just like mathematically, the further away you get from 50, the kind of more valuable your edge that you have is. So I would just rather, I don't want anything to do with medians, even if in theory it is like, sure, I could have an edge because my median is different. I'd rather just be right, and have a 1% edge when I'm dealing with like something that's, I think is 2% likely, and the books are saying is 1% likely. Just the payoff is much richer.
What are the challenges in terms of handling variance over that time frame? Because you could be fundamentally correct and not hit one of these 100-to-1s all season, depending on how many you're betting.
Yeah, I thankfully that hasn't happened yet. Yeah, I mean, like that's almost like a psychology question, where it's like, how do you deal with it? And the answer to me is like I've trained myself at this point to know like this variance is the name of the game, and it is the kind of blessing that allows me to like have what I think is a huge edge. But also like it's possible it's not going to work, and there are just absolutely crushing losses. I mean, like I had in week 3, I must have had 4 like huge parlays that missed by either like a yard on the field or like 4 quarterback passing yards. And kind of what I like to say is that if my thesis and like game script is playing out and like one little thing could have changed different, that to me, and like I come up 6 yards short, like you're doing the right thing. Those are going to fall eventually. The more bets that you're placing and the kind of more often those sorts of game scripts happen, like I'll be fine. But it is certainly very daunting. The problem is not like, and you hear this all the time amongst like a more casual crowd of like, oh, my parlay was so close. This player was like 40 yards off. I was like, yeah, well, you're banking on like an additional 10 plays that don't exist. It's when like you see it that the game could have played out a tiny bit differently, and that would have led to a hit. Like as that happens more often, that's kind of how I almost judge my process, because you can't use like CLV, you can't use any of your more traditional metrics to gauge how you're doing. That's kind of my proxy, and you deal with the variance. And I still have not lost sight of the fact that like it makes games very entertaining to watch, and I'm still a football fan, a sports fan. And I try and enjoy it, even if there are going to be some absolutely crushing losses and you're going to be on the wrong side of variance sometimes.
I would think that the most difficult thing would be actually estimating your expected ROI on these, because I know you mentioned that when you are doing modeling stuff, but there are things, especially with small samples, where you're not going to have an exact price on it. So I guess my question is, how do you estimate your expected ROI? Do you actually spit out a price for each SGP you bet, or at least a price range, and say, this is my threshold? Because I'm sure there's roads you go down looking at a potential SGP and you say, okay, actually, I don't think this is quite enough. I'm not getting paid quite enough. There's too much, there's not enough negative correlation here being priced in, etc.
Yeah. So I don't think you can come up with an exact number. You're going to run into the exact problem that I'm trying to solve, which is you are going to try and force a modeled relationship on, like, you're going to run into the same small sample size issues. You're going to run into the same tails issues. So I think you have some band. Like, who can know what Tank Bigsby's alt rushing line yard is going to be when like his role is completely uncertain? Like, we're all guessing. We're all guessing if he's going to see like 30% of the share or 60% of the share. But it's
But you
like,
have to
let's
make a
lean.
guess, right?
But you have to make a guess.
So
Exactly.
are you saying
Exactly.
like, I'm going to guess that it's somewhere in the range of this to this, and then based on 30 to 60%, and then if it's if the low end is 30%, then that equates to this price for this SGP.
Exactly. So that's precisely how you do it. Is you basically say like, where you have these bands of like, what would I need both from a like whatever it is, like if it's basketball, like minutes, or in football, like usage, and then you can kind of from that assumption work at the price that you need. But it's all about like that initial assumption is like, and I am the first to admit, like, not precise, and it can't be precise by definition.
Can you go back and sort of assess how good those assumptions you've made are? I mean, because we know how much randomness there is overall in the SGP outcome, because you have to hit all these different things. But can you go back and look and say, okay, I thought that quarterbacks would be injured at this rate, or that this, backup running back, basically anytime you have to sort of have a order of magnitude estimate, like if you kind of write that down and quantify it and be like, okay, have I been overstating this or not?
Yeah. So this actually, I think, gets to Jeff's earlier question about medians, and maybe I wasn't perfectly understanding it before. But The way I like to do this, especially early on in seasons, is basically take like, let's say I'm betting on an alt quarterback passing prop. I want to see if I'm betting this in week 3, what is like the range that it settles at from weeks like 8 to 14. And I'm basically making a bet on a quarterback being particularly good. And the market has effectively updated over time. And you can do this on the in-game level. It's very easy when I gave an example of like Tank's Big B 30 versus 60. Like that, you can just track, like, are you right more often than not? And are you directionally accurate? But what I'm like really using in addition to what I outlined earlier of just like understanding the game scripts and the game flow and seeing like, could this bet actually have hit given the game script, is looking back and saying like, let's take a almost like a rematch price of a game, a player, a parlay, and obviously they're going to be idiosyncrasies to each matchup, and you can't perfectly map the two. But like, look back in 2 months from now and say like, did I have this right 2 months ago? Like, have the markets almost moved closer to me or not? And like, was my median actually like maybe a little bit further to the right or further to the left of the tail when I was initially betting it?
So slight, like what if it's interesting if you go back to processes, like you kind of do like this research in the off season, and I'm assuming that research is sort of like this macro research that you find interesting, but then it ultimately, when you find insights, feeds well into where you get your edges. Do you ever think about any of the work that you do and how it might be able to impact actually working for a team? Like, has that, like hearing you talk a little bit about the nuances about football, it's interesting because I think a little bit about like roster construction or like how you would choose, especially given the fact that some of the origin story you have is from Pro Football Focus and the idea of, grading positions and what that means, because obviously there's still quite a bit of inefficiency in roster construction and whatnot as far like, so are there any insights that you've gained that you think have directly applicable? Like if I said to you tomorrow, hey, I'm buying a team due to come work for me, what would be the first couple things that you might attack?
Yeah, I mean, like most of the research I do can be applied. I prefer it in the betting, like as an expression, but yeah, like the offensive line stuff, let's say, I would say it's basically never worth it to pay a left tackle elite money. Like that's not something I would do. I would also pair like.
Wait, let's talk about that. Let's hold on. Let's talk about
Okay.
it for that for a second, because the Blind Side and Michael Lewis and all of that, and the Lawrence Taylor origin story would tell everyone that that's not true, right? Like we've gone around saying, oh, the second most important position in football is the left tackle. So explain to me why I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think it's the wide receiver. It's like a necessary and sufficient problem. If right, the offensive line is a weak link system, so you can have 4 guys doing their job, but if one fails, the play is blown up, right? So you basically want to have a bunch of guys who are all like average rather than elite. But really, what this is about is even if you do have a left tackle or 5 guys on the offensive line who are really great, your offensive output still requires quarterback to make good throws, receivers to get open. So if you look at a curve of like effectively, you can like guarantee, let's say you have the best left tackle in the world, and you can guarantee that your left tackle is never going to allow pressure. Obviously, that's not realistic, but that's still like the curve just flattens because you still need 4 other guys on the offensive line to do their job. You still need receivers to get open, and you still need a quarterback to execute on a good throw. So they're just diminishing returns from basically getting to a level where like you don't have to worry about the left tackle. There are so many other pieces that like you're not benefiting that much from going from like a good player to an elite player, and you're paying a massive premium currently in the NFL market.
Is there a position where you would, besides quarterback, where you would say that there's kind of the opposite structure, where it's really worth it to go for the super elite guy?
Pass rush. Of like you can almost take advantage of the weak link. If you get the Dallas Cowboys and the Cleveland Browns have basically lived off, and the Pittsburgh Steelers have lived off of dominant edge players. And like another good example of the process we're talking about. On-off splits are generally noisy, right? You don't want to look at like one player and say because there's so many different confounding factors here, whatever matchups. You can name it. You don't want to look at the on-off splits. The Pittsburgh Steelers, with or without TJ Watt, we have like a very large sample of this. Like, it's impossible to ignore. Like, you would be doing yourself a disservice. The market disagrees with you. He matters so much to that Steelers defense. The same is true of Micah Parsons in Dallas. The same is true of Myles Garrett in Cleveland. Like absolute game wreckers, precisely because like you can take advantage of the weakest link, and like Edge is such a strong link system. They're extremely, extremely valuable, especially on the tails.
What are some other strong link systems? Would you consider wide receivers a strong link system?
Yeah, you just need one to get open. I would say that's probably still the second most important position in football. But
Really?
you're constantly dealing with a system of like weak links and strong links, and like secondary is a weak link system, right? You just need one person to fail. This is another study that I've done about perfect coverage, defined as when one player does not do their job, and like the offensive output of a play with perfect coverage is equivalent to like 2 times worse than the worst offense in the league. Whereas plays with a coverage mistake or no perfect coverage, you become the best NFL offense, at least in the base rates.
Would you say that for weak link systems, coaching is more important as well? Cohesion?
Yeah, and I think that also these are not completely independent, right? Another study I've done about like the coverage outcomes are so much a function of the positions that you're put into, and that makes sense when you think about like a scheme, and like especially when players are playing zone coverage, like they are not on islands isolated, like they are all doing their assignment relative to the next person who's also doing their assignment, and their assignment in isolation makes no sense unless you understand it as like part of a bigger picture. Like that is coverage at a very high and abstract level, and like the Minnesota Vikings, who like do not have particularly great talent on defense, but have this incredible coordinator, have and we see examples of this all the time, have basically like built up secondaries that are successful. And like we say, like coverage is voodoo, and like individual players are generally pretty unstable, with the exception of a few. Again, global relationship versus some exceptions. But it's not a coincidence, I think, that there are certain defensive coordinators who seemingly are always having success, and certain players who, like the Los Angeles Chargers, like are effectively the same coverage unit this year as previous seasons. The players are the same, but like they're way outperforming. I don't think that's just like the players getting magically better. It's all a function of like how they fit into the scheme.
It's fascinating because I think if you look from a macro perspective, you would call football generally a weak link system, right? And ultimately what you're trying to do to get edge is find the strong links that you can have, like edge, in this case, wide receiver. Quarterback is the most obvious one, right? Where do you think running backs fall into this category?
I think it's like, I mean, it's not really a system because they're kind of an individual, but it's a strong link of like the better, right? Of course, running back messing up on the play does it, like it matters a lot, and a running back like succeeding also is effectively on him. It interacts with offensive line and scheme in particularly interesting ways, where like we're even seeing this now. I don't know why I keep on bringing up just like very detailed football examples. Devon Achane went from like having one of the best statistical rush seasons last year, and he was like by far the leader in like any rush yards over expected model that you're going to detail. And this year he's one of the worst. And like actually, it's not just offensive line; it also interacts with their quarterback, and like the threat of a pass. And this is stuff that like I think data scientists have had some trouble trying to kind of study, but is undoubtedly true. That like the gravity of your quarterback, both by this is something that has been studied, of like rushing quarterbacks are going to allow more space because linebackers are slower to move to the ball. The Washington offense this season, Brian Robinson didn't just magically turn into a great running back. It's very much, I think, a product of the offensive line, the fact that like you have to, as a linebacker, respect the threat of a Jaden Daniels run. So I guess to answer your question is, I think running back is the perfect example of like they're almost the most dependent on the surroundings, which is like if you are hit 3 yards behind the line of scrimmage on every play, you're not going to be successful. Definitely not referencing Saquon Barkley and his time with the Giants. But that said, it is still strong link in the sense of like once you are like given the situation, how good can you kind of produce good outcomes? Like that is strong link.
But I mean, if you go to this back to the origin of this question, which was like roster construction, it'd be hard pressed for me to believe that running back would be a place that I would spend money because so many other things dictate their success, right? Ultimately. And, again, like this is, I don't have the answer to this, and I'm just kind of like ruminating a little bit on it because, you've convinced me that edge rushers are important, and like to get an elite edge rusher is probably really important. To get an elite wide receiver that can always get open is incredibly important. We've known quarterbacks, but I'm still on. And then you've also convinced me that this idea of like paying Tyron Smith or someone like that a ton of money is probably a fool's errand. So like where are we on running backs though, really? Because you, even in your answer, you kind of like went full
They said
circle.
it's context dependent, which means there's so much that they don't control.
Right. So you wouldn't want to pay one,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But,
Yeah,
but,
I mean
but
that's not even
yeah.
the main reason you don't want to pay one is because like their injury risk is way higher than anyone else and the replacement value. But yeah, to Rufus's point, like that is what I would say. It's context dependent. And like I think that's true of everything, by the way. Like, and you can see this in the way I bet and also in the way I would theoretically construct a team, which is that like certain players have more value depending on the context in which they're in. So like if you are starting, if I was an owner of a team and like I had to have a particular defensive coordinator that like isn't great at scheming coverage, like I might want to pay for a premium corner, whereas like if I knew that I had Brian Flores, I might be willing to spend elsewhere because I know that he can kind of propagate worse corners. And like these things are constantly interacting. That's what makes football, I think, so interesting to study and makes roster construction questions or betting questions particularly relevant because like nothing is true and universal. There is no like, right, like expected points added. I'm going to go on a little bit of a turn here. Like expected points added is taking a theoretical team in theoretical, like what would an average team do in an average situation? Like that never exists. There's always a particular team that has particular team tendencies going up against a defense that has their own team tendencies. Like you are constantly balancing these interactions, and like nothing is really true. Like universal is the best we can do. It's a good average, but if you're going to kind of take the means of everything, you're going to get average results.
Okay, can we shift it into a topic which I find going to be interesting, which is around game theory and non-stationarity as it pertains to the game itself. So in other words, how do you think about when you talked about like, oh, the Patrick Mahomes has this same thing over 5 years, or, someone new. If you look at when you try to predict what like usage will look like or what game script will look like, you have like two interesting factors. One is the macro of what's happening in the game, like whether it's like two high safeties or that kind of thing. We talked about that ad nauseum last week. How do you think broadly about stationarity in like the data sets you're looking at? And then also, how do you think about just general game theory as it pertains to like what a game script might play out?
So you're working with, first off, you're working with a ton of uncertainty. Like that needs to be said from the outset. The answer, there is no one answer. So like you look at a team like the Eagles, or even the Bills now, and like they are going to play to their opponent's weaknesses. So when like the Ravens are a team that is one of the best against the run and has struggled a bit against the pass, like the Bills are going to throw way more than expectation relative to the rest of the league and way more to like their own expectation. There are certain teams that it's like kind of sticky what they're going to do. Other teams are just going to like do their thing. The Cincinnati Bengals are going to throw a ton. Like I'm using run pass splits as an example. You can kind of do that for any subcategory. The answer is like the beauty of football relative to other sports is that it's like very easy to follow. Where like there's only one game a week, there are only 17 games. You can really stay on top of like, especially when you're doing this full time as I am, you can stay on top of every single detail of the games. And like I do it almost like you can't model this, and I do this from like really deeply understanding the team tendencies. And there's no one rule because it is like completely dependent on like what each team is going to do And when we have like situations that change, you kind of have to use like your judgment in understanding like, was this a 1 week anomaly? Was this a 3 week anomaly or not? But there's no one answer.
Like it. Rufus, you have any last, or Peter Jennings, you have any last questions for
I
our
definitely
guest?
have more questions.
Okay, go for it.
So I guess one is SGP related and the other is the sort of earned drive points. And I don't know which one we want to start. Maybe let's go with the earned drive points first. So talk a little bit about the statistic you created. And I mean, I find it interesting because I've always thought EPA is fundamentally flawed in a lot of ways because just how explanatory it is, right? Like a 4th and 1 at the goal line is a ridiculously high leverage play. And it's, you know, an inch here, an inch there is going to have it's going to swing the expected points like 6 points, right? And so, first, I guess, talk a little bit about earned drive points and does it capitalize on on some of the things that sort of looking at play success metrics does?
Yeah. So first off, like, I guess I gave a little bit of a kind of like why I don't agree with some of the assumptions of EPA. I think you make another great counter argument. The first place we got to start is like understanding that I think that drives are kind of the unit to be used here because like plays are all happening in sequence of each other. That's both from like how they are called and also like when we think of EPA, it is not. I've actually had to explain this recently to some people. It is not the expected points of a given play. It is the expected points of a drive given that you are in this play. I just think the natural unit of analysis is the drive. That is what like teams are doing when they have the ball. Like maybe series. It's definitely not plays. But yes.
Well, wait, could you
think,
argue that, you know, a team isn't necessarily trying to maximize, they're trying to maximize their points on the drive. They're not trying to maximize every play, like every play is basically what you're saying.
they're sometimes not trying to maximize points either. Sometimes they're trying to maximize win
Yeah.
probability, which is not always the same as points.
Agree.
But yeah, so that's like kind of the fundamental assumption. It's like we want to create a drive level statistic. So this does not really map to plays well, but it's also trying to kind of make the case that there is no theoretical scenario of like average team versus like average defense in an average situation. There are also some biases of like the better team you are, the more plays you're going to run. And it's actually like biasing EPA towards better teams because there's a little bit of a selection problem there. But nonetheless, yeah. So what EDP is trying to do, earn drive points, is to say like how repeatable and sustainable is your success, and it's going to use kind of team tendencies and how teams have performed. So it's going to downweight explosive success for teams that have struggled in that area. And it's going to do that a little bit less so for like the 2018 Chiefs with Patrick Mahomes. So it's going to basically build in priors of how good offenses are and how good they are in particular situations. Certain teams are going to be better in obvious passing downs. Like Patrick Mahomes is a very different quarterback on 3rd and 8 than whatever insert rant Trevor Simeon. And like we should not be treating those two as having equal expectancy. They don't. So you're building in these priors, and you're basically building a model that's trying to say like how reproducible and sustainable is the success on the drive level, and it's mapped to kind of points per drive.
Okay, going back to the SGPs, can you give me an example of an NFL SGP angle or principle that you now think you previously over or underestimated to the point that bets you'd made in the past you think probably were unprofitable in expectation?
I would say that I did not fully understand. Like I would too often add quarterback passing yards to receiver alts, where I was like, and it's almost like I started from backwards logic of like, I thought the receiver was going to do, right, like for whatever reason, man zone, let's just say, like, I thought like this receiver's particular alt line at like 100 was really mispriced. And then I said, well, like, if that's going to happen, like the quarterback's probably going to do X. And because I hadn't perfectly modeled some of this stuff yet, I would be overestimating. And like in particular, the correlation that like a book is using Certainly now it's almost never worth it to add that leg. In fact, it's probably worth it to take the under. But that's a like great example of something I overestimated. And like also I would say like these things are constantly changing. Like books are changing, the relationships themselves are changing as the game changes with like too high structures, and that's like it all points back to the same idea of like you have fundamentally very little data to model at the NFL, and the data itself changes. The game is not the same in 2020 as it was in 2024, but like you have to use that data to actually model things. So being able to stay on top of that and say, like this is the more relevant data point. Like 2024 matters more for this point. And you have to like, even as like a data-driven person, you have to be willing to say like, just because I can't perfectly quantify this, like doesn't mean that the edge doesn't exist and isn't directionally right. And I might not be able to like perfectly Kelly criterion this, but that doesn't mean that there isn't value. And it doesn't mean that I can't be successful. And like, it's okay, especially when we're working on the tails, to not have a precise answer and still be directionally right and still make money.
It's easy, right? It's easier to beat the model, to find the weakness in the model than it is. I mean, because it's impossible to build a perfect model for all this stuff.
Yeah, I'm a market taker though. I'm not a market maker. I don't have to.
Yeah.
It's a completely different problem if I was the one who had to make the SGPs. But the benefit I have is that I get to say no, and I get to kind of pick off those 1% cases. And when books are offering thousands and thousands of markets, these spots just pop up all the time.
Okay, so actually, this made me think of a different question. Let's say some book offers you a 7-figure salary to come in and say, I want you to fix all our loopholes in SGPs and help us price them. How would you go about?
Can I give my phone number now? Yeah, it's still hard to getting down on SGPs is a separate conversation. The limits, and especially the to win limits, are still going to be small. And this is like, I do think it's interesting work. I think that it's still going to run into a lot of just like fundamental problems with modeling football. But I do think it's conceptually a very, very interesting question. And when I think about, and Jeff, you mentioned of like, or I guess kind of like touched on like almost like would I want to work for a team or a lot of the research there. Like I find the two most interesting kind of questions in sports or sports is like, how do we price correlations of different outcomes? And like I do love the market dynamics too, of like every week kind of being its own puzzle. That yeah, I would be very, very interested in like really getting down to the nitty-gritty of pricing these things. And like I don't know what I would do, and I would probably have to learn a lot about certain kind of modeling techniques and how to deal with certain sample sizes. But it's definitely an interesting problem to me conceptually of like how do we price X given Y and all those sorts of things.
Awesome. Well, go ahead, Rufus. You have one more?
I guess the last question is, how much would you say of your alpha comes from, better football knowledge, better analytics knowledge, better data, just grinding and just curiosity, clicking through the apps, better models? I guess where if you had to sort of say.
I don't think it's football knowledge, especially not in the way that like people think of it. Like I'm not like an X's and O's guy, and I can't scheme. I think I definitely have better data. I've definitely been very creative with that data to try and look like I don't know. I'm constantly creating like a lot of new metrics that I find have signal and are spots that the market's not looking. I think just like having creativity with that and also being willing to like try and quantify the things that you're seeing while having like pretty good data is probably most of it. And like there is definitely something to be said. And like, look, I would be extremely skeptical of myself if I heard myself on this podcast of like, there's a certain experience of like having been in the weeds of the sport where you can like start to get a sense of certain like trends or like, hey, this thing's been happening the last 3 weeks, and you're like, this scenario happened, in weeks 6 through 8 of 2022. I have an incredible memory. That certainly helps. Maybe it also it hurts me in certain spots where I'm biased towards it. But I would say that like a combination of asking certain questions about the game that are going to lead you to creation of your own data, understanding team tendencies, and like being able to tie that back to certain things you've seen in the past. Those are probably my two biggest spots. Anyone, if they looked hard enough, can find a lot of the like systemic edges that I found. That's not particularly difficult, I don't think. But like actually having an understanding on a first principles level of like how the game is going to be played out, how these things are being priced on the other end, and then thinking through these these combinations, and then like having the data to support it is probably kind of the most of the variance of my success.
Well, and that also really help. I mean, that's hugely valuable in terms of account longevity, because if you're doing stuff, it's not like someone could say, "Oh, you're exploiting this one angle."
Yeah,
You have a bunch of things that are all different, and it's based on, models you built, things you've researched.
precisely. It's
Yeah.
almost its whole separate conversation. But like I found myself in like very, very lucky the timing of this all also. Or like there's a certain book that like I have won way more money on than any other. And I have 4 times the limit on my own personal account. Because like I've just bet SGPs and they think I'm a fish. And like it's really difficult to detect that what I'm doing is like than like the most recreational of flow. But like if the sports books are telling me that they want me to bet on something, I'm going to try and find the edge there. And like I don't have to deal with the same like most of the battle, as you guys know, obviously, is like not finding the bet. It's like actually just making sure you have outs. And if I can like really spend all my time on the football stuff, not have to worry about like bypassing limits, or like the books are begging me to bet on SGPs. They're begging me. I'm like glad to kind of exploit that.
Awesome. I love it. This is like fascinating, Judah. Thank you so much for joining us. Love to have you on again some point to talk more about like specifics and things you're seeing in the NFL. But thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was great.
So that was our interview with Judah Fortgang. Rufus and I were about to start talking about this off the air, and then we realized that it might make for good content, which is rare for this podcast. So what I found interesting is I almost felt like he relished the idea of small sample size. Like he just like got really excited about the idea of there not being a lot of data to support a lot of these things, and that's why there's edges. And
Yeah.
again, you go back to this idea that like he had this very profound thing that he said about directionally correct and like all this like uncertainty and embracing like it's this like trend that we've been going with this podcast where we've gone away from and it's interesting because I remember there was like a Discord or something like that was just like making fun of me because it said that like I like was poo-pooing the idea that people can make a lot of money or get a lot of money down on player props and that kind of stuff. And like, I do think like my approach and, you can speak for yourself, is like a little bit of a dinosaur approach compared to like, if you look at, like, I'm looking at this young kid that's sharp and like working on this. Like he said, I can do this because it's my full-time job. I can be on top of all of this all the time. And then I
Mhm.
look at like who I can't even get you to fucking schedule a podcast in time because you're too busy with other things. And it's like, and you're doing golf and whatnot. And it's like, how in the world can someone like you now compete with this guy in the NFL? And you're not because
True.
he's not
I
really
can't.
doing, but yeah, that's, you know what I'm saying? It's just like, it's crazy to think about as we start bringing on these like younger and like hungrier, like all that kind of stuff, like this macro topic that we talk about, like how do you continue to have your edge as you even get older and your priorities shift and what kind of thing. So I thought that was like a
Well,
very
and I think,
fascinating,
right,
he was
like
fascinating to have on.
I'm a full-time bettor, yet I feel like I have no time and no time to actually do real analysis anymore. It's kind of funny how it works.
Yeah,
They,
I mean, you also like have a lot of things going on in your life. Like you're on
I
the
have more balance now.
dating circuit. You're like, trying to work out and become yoked. Like you're traveling to England and all this kind of stuff.
Aspen
We
this week.
We got invited to a Premier League game. I said I couldn't go, but I said you would probably likely want to go. So I will, by an owner of a team, we can,
Oh, when?
at any point of
Ah,
an owner of a Premier League team, invited us. And I said, until my kids are ready to fly with me, probably not, but then at some point. So, should we talk a little bit? When do you want to do do you want to do a trip around college before this or after this? Have we already done it? Like, should we?
I don't know. That is a Jeff question.
All right, why don't we tackle and look at college? How did college go for you? Did you happen to watch the Georgia Alabama game?
I watched the fourth quarter. I was on a JetBlue flight and was able to watch the fourth quarter, which was pretty cool.
Yeah. Did that game
I
make
was
you
on my way out to
feel
LA. Yeah.
did that game make you feel more confident or fewer confident in Georgia's ability to win a national championship?
I didn't see the whole game, so I can't really speak to it. I think it would make me feel confident that Alabama and Georgia are both really good teams still, which
Yeah,
is not a surprise. What about
it's
you?
well, it's I may be a glasses half full person when it comes to Georgia because I'm a Georgia fan.
Wait, you are? Since when?
I've always been a Georgia fan. I've been like
Did wait, did you go to the University of Georgia?
you don't have to go to the university. Did you go to the University of
No,
Baltimore
but what?
Orioles?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I did.
Yeah, you did.
There,
Like you've
no
gone and you've been in
accreditation,
their farm system and you've been like, like it's no, I
but
mean
look,
like
I did. I grew up in the DC area. The Nationals weren't there in my formative years, so they were the local team. I just don't know in what universe the University of Georgia would have been, I don't know, a logical place for you to land.
I don't know if you followed this podcast, but I've been a Georgia fan for quite some time.
Well, that's because
you
of
should
your
ask
futures bets.
Preston Johnson
You've
if
had
that's true or
futures
not.
bets on Georgia, and now you're a Georgia fan because of that.
Well, sure, tomato, but like
Okay.
it's like a real fandom that I have for a team, right? Like so,
I
and
mean,
it's
look,
not like
who am I to fan shame?
it's not like I have a natural team that I could have followed, right? Like my team that I would follow is not a particularly
Did you all
good
even have a football team?
Yeah, of course we did. We have a Division III football team. We're
Okay.
not winning national championships though.
You
Well,
weren't
maybe we
winning
are at the
Division
Division
Three
three
national
level.
championships?
Yeah, maybe we are at the Division III level. Okay, so what were we talking about? Oh yeah, so the Georgia game, the glass is half full would be that Georgia lost that game by one score after being down, 3 touchdowns, looking dead, and turned the ball over 4 times, right? And
Mhm.
was that close to basically winning that game. And so on the road in Alabama, and clearly where Alabama is better than priors would have said, because they have these like elite skill position players that are 17 years old. And anyway, so I think again, Georgia has a ridiculous rest of the schedule. They have to play Texas on the road, Ole Miss on the road, and Tennessee at home. So they have 3 monster games, and they're going to have to win probably 2 out of 3 of those games to go to the national championship. They can probably lose one of them, would be my guess, but
Yeah, I
they
mean, I think
definitely
they get
cannot
in
lose.
with one loss for sure.
No,
I
no,
don't see
no.
any universe where they don't.
The question
The
is, will they
playoff.
get in with 2 losses, right?
Right.
Like because I'm saying they already have one loss. So the question is, can they lose
Oh,
one of
yeah.
those 3 games? And my guess
So
is
I wasn't even considering the Alabama game a loss for some reason, even though, of course, one team lost.
the other Alabama had more points than Georgia, so
That's how it normally works.
that's theoretically a loss.
That's called analytics, Jeff.
Do you want to do a quick like jump around college or
Yeah, we can discuss a few games.
okay? Which ones would you like to discuss?
I'm open to suggestions.
Which are there ones that you still show value on after you guys have placed your bets? And how did you guys do last week?
We had a good week last week. I mean, it wasn't great. It was maybe like a 4 to 5% ROI. So, you know,
Got it.
one of those types. It felt like we were very close to a much bigger weekend. We lost a few close ones, but I'll take it.
Okay, so
So
any games still that you, yeah.
so Stanford, Virginia Tech's an interesting one. Now that line circa opened at Virginia Tech -3. That moved 6.5 points in a day. I know Stanford, their starter hurt his ankle at the end of last game, and their freshman backup is also out. So, but the third stringer is actually experienced, so it's shouldn't be as much of a drop off as you'd expect, given it's third stringer at Stanford. And we took +9.5 there. I believe as of 30
Yeah,
minutes ago.
it's
So this
plus 9 minus 115 right now on Chris. So
plus
you guys
nine, yeah.
probably moved the market a little bit.
You
What
said that
about
earlier. And I mean, I have that around -5.
what about the University of California, who was going to be featured on game day this week for the first time ever, playing Miami at home, getting 10.5.
Yeah, that's one that we actually, oh, we bet it. I was like, it doesn't like highlight right now as a play, but that's one that that's one that we bet, but probably wouldn't bet at the current price. So
What did you
the
bet it
current price
at?
is 10.5. We make it 9. We got it at 12.5.
Got it.
I mean, look, I I need to now find a bet where we got a worse price to kind of make up for that.
Just find one.
Okay.
I'll look for one. Go
Duke,
ahead.
Georgia Tech. We took +7.5 and +8, and the line's now +9.5.
Good. I like it. So give the people something they want.
Give them some
Um,
adverse selection.
Adverse selection. All right. Well, we'll talk to you guys all again next week. And always open to guest suggestions. But hopefully everyone has a great football season, or football week. So we'll talk to you guys all again next
Yeah,
week.
hopefully the Orioles can wake up and start playing baseball again for the first time in 3 months.
Let's all hope for that.